Hello there, good people of the internet and the bad people of the world, and those who operate in some kind of salubrious middle lane between being a complete piece of shit and an absolute hero, and you're kind of traversing it like that Rodney P tune, doing 120 in the middle lane in the rain. If you've heard that one, lucky weekend. It's a bit shit, it's not that bad though. Yeah. Hello, anyway, I'll put my credibility glasses on so I can sort of read, and with the opening gambit of a very classic lyric we've all heard: war, what is it good for? And ostensibly, the answer is absolutely nothing. Couldn't be more true. So here's a bit of an expose into not what we've been bombarded with over the last kind of couple of days regarding Iran and the Middle East, but actually what's been going on with Russia and the UK in the last kind of few weeks or like so. Because for us, Iran could reach us with with missiles, but they're only going to be like cruise missiles. I mean, say only, they're not going to be. They don't have ICBMs, nuclear armed ICBMs, which are fucking terrifying. I mean, Google it. It's like, yeah, they break up into multiple parts with like loads of nukes in the exosphere and then rain down on it. Yeah, it's fucking horrible shit. Don't want that to happen at all. But anyway, here's some like international relations and politics. I don't know what the fuck that photo is. It takes automatic photos when I'm doing the screen recording. That's terrible, isn't it? Just leave that one out for a bit. Yeah, let's go into deep research as ever for my fucking vacuous and banal content. Let's see what it says. I'll put myself in the little jibbity jibber, get this silent floating widget thing out of the way, start reading some words, and then hopefully by midday it'll be time for me lunch and I'll get at least 10 views on this searing geopolitical analysis of the conflagration between Russia and the United Kingdom. It's titled The Silent Conflagration, Unmasking the UK's Strategic Vulnerabilities Amidst the Russian Shadow Fleet and the New Age of Undersea Warfare. So the global geopolitical landscape in the spring of 2026 is defined by an unprecedented volatility, overlapping crises and the rapid erosion of traditional deterrence architectures, while the attention of the international community and the legacy media in the United Kingdom has been overwhelmingly consumed by the eruption of a direct conflict in the Middle East. A far more insidious and existential threat has been quietly consolidating closer to home. A careful analysis of the press releases issued by the British Military of Defence, Ministry of Defence, MOD, has, between late March and early April 26, revealed a military apparatus scrambling to address critical vulnerabilities in the face of aggressive Russian posturing. This report provides an exhaustive tactical and strategic expose of the United Kingdom's current military standing against the Russian Federation. It critically examines the deployment of apocalyptic asymmetric weaponry, specifically the 2M39 Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle UUV, and the alarming persistent occupation of sovereign UK waters by Russian intelligence platforms and a deniable shadow fleet. Furthermore, the analysis explores the glaring absence of a comprehensive domestic air defence network, a vulnerability brutally highlighted by recent events in the Middle East, and the paradoxical economic reliance that leaves NATO allies in a severely counter-indicative strategic position. So by synthesising tactical intelligence, maritime law and geopolitical macro trends, this report paints a stark picture of the UK's operational reality and the catastrophic consequences that loom if a diplomatic resolution to the current continental standoff is not achieved. Overall warnings decoding the Ministry of Defence's Spring 26 dispatches. So in the shadow of the Middle Eastern crisis, the UK MOD releases a flurry of critical public statements and strategic directives. But these announcements, largely ignored by the national press, outline sweeping changes in British military posture urgent technological acquisitions and a radical shift in maritime enforcement protocols. So you've got a load of dates there, and from the Prime Minister's office, the UK Defence Innovation, MOD, DTSL, British Army, DSTL, sorry, and they've sort of said that they're authorising UK armed forces to board and seize sanctioned Russian vessels, so transiting UK territorial waters, specifically targeting the English Channel. They have had a joint US and UK solicitation for commercial technology to detect, track and physically defeat unmanned underwater vehicles threatening critical infrastructure, issued urgent financial and material commitment to protect Ukrainian cities, simultaneously highlighting the depletion of domestic European air defence stockpiles, and successful trials by 33 Engineer Regiment utilising artificial intelligence to rapidly identify explosive ordnance, signalling a $4 billion investment in autonomous systems. I won't, as ever, go through the table. If I can be asked, I'll put a link in the description, but I probably won't. I don't reckon anyone will care anyway. These seemingly disparate announcements are deeply interconnected. They reflect a defence establishment acutely aware of its vulnerabilities in the maritime and aerospace domains, attempting to rapidly field artificial intelligence and autonomous systems to compensate for a historically hollowed out conventional force structure. The authorisation to interdict the shadow fleet represents a profound escalation in the economic war against Moscow, while Project Reef is a tacit administration that the UK currently lacks the capability to defend its coastal infrastructure from next-generation Russian submersibles. The Iranian distraction and the shifting balance of power. To fully grasp the precariousness of the UK's position vis-à-vis Russia, one must contextualise the ongoing Middle Eastern conflict purely through the lens of great power competition. So on February the 28th, 26, the United States and Israel initiated a major conflict with Iran, launching surprise airstrikes, resulted in the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and several high-ranking Iranian officials. The immediate Iranian retaliation fundamentally altered the global balance of power, creating a tech-heavy, diplomatically unstable conflagration that's inadvertently served as a massive strategic windfall for Vladimir Putin. The conflict physically reached European sovereign territory on March the 1st and the 2nd, 2026, when Hezbollah-aligned forces launched one-way attack drones believed to be Iranian-designed Shahed variants at the UK's RAF Akrotiri base in Cyprus. Pretty bold move there. While force protection measures and Hellenic Air Force's F-16 successfully intercepted the incoming threats, the attack demonstrated the expansive, borderless nature of modern drone warfare. The UK was forced to acknowledge that US U-2 surveillance aircraft and support assets were utilising British bases for operations against Iran, intertwining British overseas territories with the broader US-Israeli campaign and exposing them to direct kinetic retaliation. So from strategic perspectives, this Middle Eastern conflagration is a catastrophic distraction for NATO. The UK Armed Forces are currently deploying advanced finite assets to the Eastern Mediterranean to protect regional assets. HMS Dragon, a highly capable 45 destroyer, was dispatched to integrate into the Cyprus defences, while RAF Typhoons, F-35s and ground-based counter-drone systems are actively engaged in the region. RAF Regiment gunners have even achieved unprecedented status by shooting down multiple Iranian drones. However, naval and aerospace power is a zero-sum game. Every asset deployed to the Mediterranean is an asset removed from the North Atlantic, the North Sea and the Baltic, so granting the Russian Northern and Baltic fleets greater operational freedom. Furthermore, Iran has utilised the conflict to establish control over the Strait of Hormuz, which we've heard loads about, threatening commercial shipping and demanding toll collections in Chinese yen. This severe disruption has trapped roughly 15% of the global oil supply, sending Brent crude prices soaring way up to over $100 a barrel. The resulting global energy crisis has been a financial masterstroke for Russia. As Gulf supplies contract, nations desperate for energy have turned to Russian crude, allowing Moscow to narrow the discount on its oil, bypass Western sanctions and inject billions of unexpected tax revenues into its war machine. See how that kind of works out there. The United Kingdom finds itself fighting a tech-heavy asymmetrical proxy war in the Middle East that inadvertently funds its primary existential adversary in Europe. The unshielded island, Britain's catastrophic dome deficit. The Iranian retaliation in early 26 provided a terrifying preview of modern ballistic warfare, exposing a critical flaw in British national security: the total absence of a mainland anti-ballistic missile ABM shield. During the barrage against Israel, Iran utilised its advanced Khorramshahr, whatever the fuck that says, ballistic missiles equipped with cluster warheads. Dispersing up to 80 submunitions mid-air, these cluster payloads successfully overwhelmed the interceptor algorithms on Israel's Iron Dome, widely considered the world's most sophisticated multi-layered defence architecture. At least 19 ballistic missiles penetrated Israeli airspace and struck urban centres, proving that even the most advanced interception networks can be saturated by relatively cheap submunition dispersible tactics. So this tactical evolution sent shockwaves through the UK military establishment. If the world's most defended airspace could be fractured by cluster munitions, the undefended skies of the United Kingdom would offer zero resistance to modern Russian hypersonic glide vehicles or submunition-equipped Iskander missiles. Unlike many of its European NATO allies, the United Kingdom does not field advanced ground-based air defence, GBAD they call it, or ABM systems such as the Patriot French-Italian SAMP/T or the American THAAD. Current indigenous European systems are primarily designed for countering intra-atmospheric threats like cruise missiles and wholly lack the specific exo-atmospheric intercept capabilities required to neutralise immediate range ballistic missiles. There's a loaded stuff on a table you can read later. Defence of the British mainland currently relies on almost entirely a handful of Royal Air Force Typhoons on quick reaction alert operating from just 2 bases, and the Royal Navy's Type 45 Daring class destroyers. While the Type 45 is a highly capable platform utilising the Aster 30 missile system, the fleet is critically undersized. One of the 6 destroyers in existence, maintenance schedules and global deployments such as the dispatch of HMS Dragon to the Mediterranean mean that only 2 to 3 of the active vehicles are 2 to 3 of them are active at any given time. These vessels are primarily tasked with protecting carrier strike groups at sea, not serving as a static shield for the British Isles. Consequently, the UK mainland is entirely defenceless against submarine-launched cruise missiles like the Russian Kalibr or conventional intermediate-range ballistic missiles fired from the Barents or the North Seas. If a barrage of conventional ballistic missiles were launched at UK critical national infrastructure, such as North Sea energy terminals, the National Grid or RAF command centres, military currently has no capability to intercept them. So just kind of allow that to sink in, like no capability at all. So there's nothing we can do. The morbid reality of current UK defence doctrine is that in the event of a decapitating strike, the mainland would suffer catastrophic damage while the 4 Vanguard-class nuclear submarines deploy to enact mutually assured destruction. Recognising this suicide pact as an inadequate conventional deterrent, military insiders, including General Sir Richard Barrons, pushed heavily for the concept of Hedgehog Britain in 2025 Strategic Defence Review, advocating for a massive immediate investment in layered homeland missile defence. Yet the procurement process remains frozen by a delayed defence investment plan and a lack of political willingness to divert funding from domestic programmes to national survival. So the Shadow Fleet and the occupation of British waters. While the aerospace domain remains unguarded, the maritime domain is actively being invaded. So the traditional conceptualisation of naval warfare relies on state-flagged warships operating under established rules of engagement. However, the Russian Federation has fundamentally altered this paradigm, deploying an immense, deniable shadow fleet of composed of ageing, unflagged or falsely flagged commercial vessels. While ostensibly used to transport sanctioned crude oil, the fleet serves a dual purpose. It acts as an economic lifeline for Moscow and functions as an asymmetric intelligence gathering and sea denial network. So the March 26 interdiction directive and tactical execution. Recognising the impunity with which these vessels operate, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer utilised the Joint Expeditionary Force JEF summit in Helsinki on March the 25th, 2026 to announce a profound escalation in British maritime policy. The UK Armed Forces were granted unprecedented authorisation to intercept, board and detain vessels belonging to the Russian Shadow Fleet operating within UK territorial waters, but this directive actively targeted the English Channel, a vital maritime artery through which an estimated 544 sanctioned Shadow Fleet vessels regularly transit. Quite a few then. The tactical execution of this directive requires immense coordination between civilian intelligence and elite military units. The UK has integrated an artificial intelligence-based tracking system known as Nordic Warden, operated through JEF. Activated in January 25, the system fuses automatic descent into identification system, data satellite imagery and Royal Air Force reconnaissance to detect vessels that go dark by disabling their transponders or when they exhibit anomalous loitering behaviour near critical undersea infrastructure. RAF maintain patrol aircraft such as the P-8A Poseidon provide persistent maritime domain awareness beyond coastal radar range, identifying specific targets for Royal Fleet auxiliary platforms that specialised boarding teams. So the physical interdictions are to be carried out by highly trained force elements, including Royal Marines, commandos and special boat service personnel who possess specific expertise to conduct opposed vessel board search and seize operations against uncooperative crews. But there is also the legal ambiguities and escalation risks. So despite the tactical readiness of British Special Forces, the legal and strategic risks of this operation are astronomically high. Maritime law experts note that under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, interfering with a foreign vessel's right to innocent passage or transit passage is fraught with legal peril. The UK government relies on the 2018 Sanctions and Money Laundering Act as its domestic legal basis, alongside the stateless vessel principle. That's UNCLOS Articles 92 and 110, which allow warships to board vessels that are falsely flagged or stateless. However, applying these laws to interdict vessels actively generating revenue for a hostile nuclear power requires relying on what experts term novel and untested legal arguments, such as treating seizures as a formal countermeasure to the war in Ukraine. So more concerning is the physical risk of escalation. In recent months, Russian Shadow Fleet vessels have increasingly been observed operating with formal Russian naval escorts in regions like the North Sea. Boarding a commercial vessel protected by a heavily armed Russian frigate or corvette threatens to trigger a direct kinetic naval engagement. Former British naval officers have explicitly warned that a miscalculation during a boarding operation could bring Britain immediately into open warfare with Russia. Consequently, the MOD has utilised the announcement primarily as a psychological deterrent, forcing Shadow Fleet operators to utilise longer, costlier circumnavigation routes around Scotland and Ireland while utilising back channels to communicate red lines to Moscow, whatever the fuck that means. The strategic hope is that the mere threat of SBS boarding teams will choke off the funds fueling the illegal invasion of Ukraine without actually firing a shot. So asymmetric seabed warfare, the Yantar loophole and civilian espionage. So the Shadow Fleet's activities extend far beyond sanctions evasion. They're actively engaged in mapping, occupying and threatening the critical national infrastructure upon which the UK and Europe rely. Russia's revised 2022 marine doctrine explicitly integrates civilian fishing and commercial vessels into its military planning, stating that trawlers would be deployed for military purposes during wartime scenarios. The subsea mapping campaign. Since 2022, Russian vessels have requested shelter in Norwegian fords, claiming distress from severe weather under UNCLOS provisions over 230 times. The investigative reviews that have demonstrated that these vessels routinely remain in sheltered waters for durations significantly longer than the adverse weather lasts, intentionally occupying areas highly concentrated with subsea data cables, natural gas pipelines, and undisclosed military installations. Norway's police security service has repeatedly warned that Russian intelligence services utilise these civilian vessels and their third country flagged crews as a deniable cover to gather intelligence on coastal infrastructure and military readiness. The most glaring and documented example of this is hybrid espionage involves the Russian fishing trawler Melkart 5. During a period in early 2022, when the critical Safbard fibre optic cable suffered unexplained severe damage, AIS tracking revealed that the Melkart 5 crossed the cable's exact coordinates over 140 times. So it could have been them. The vessel engaged in anomalous spiral-like navigation patterns entirely consistent with commercial fishing directly over the communication lifeline for the Arctic island and its vital satellite station. Similarly, vessels have loitered near the Goliath and whatever the fuck says Snovit offshore energy fields and timed their movements to coincide with major NATO exercises like Cold Response, highlighting a systemic, highly coordinated campaign to map the vulnerabilities of European energy and communication grids. The Yantar and sovereign immunity. While the UK can legally challenge commercial vessels and fishing trawlers under the sanctions law and maritime safety regulations, it remains strategically paralysed against formal state actors exploiting the seabed. The Russian search vessel Yantar, operated by the main Directorate of Deep Sea Research under Russian Ministry of Defence, serves as Moscow's premier intelligence gathering platform in European waters. The Yantar has been repeatedly observed loitering over Microsoft and Google subsea cables in the Irish Sea, operating with its AIS transponders disabled, directing lasers at RAF patrol aircraft and shadowing Allied research vessels. So lots of jip coming from them. Because the Yantar is an official commissioned vessel of the Russian Navy, it enjoys absolute sovereign immunity under the UNCLOS Articles 29, 95 and 96. It can't be boarded, inspected, seized or legally repelled from international waters or exclusive economic zones, nor is it subject to safety inspections under the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea. This creates a dangerous strategic loophole. Russia utilises immune naval vessels like the Yantar for precise, unhindered intelligence gathering and target acquisition, and subsequently contracts deniable third country flagged commercial vessels such as Eagle S or Yipeng 3 to execute destructive activities such as dragging anchors over the identified cables. The UK's response is currently limited to persistent military shadowing, an incredibly resource intensive endeavour that ties up valuable naval assets. The Abyss stares back. The Poseidon 2M39 superweapon. To understand the full existential scope of the undersea threat facing the United Kingdom, one must look beyond surface vessels and conventional hunter-killer submarines to Russia's next-generation strategic deterrent. Sorry, I've had very medicated today. The 2M39 Poseidon. This thing's fucking terrifying. So previously known by the Russian codename Status 6 or designated as Canyon by the US intelligence community, the Poseidon is a fully autonomous, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed, unmanned underwater vehicle. It's really nasty shit. So technical specification and the physics of supercavitation. The Poseidon represents a terrifying paradigm-shifting leap in naval engineering. It's not merely a torpedo, it's an abyssal drone of unprecedented proportions. So, yeah, there's a table there which says, so it's about 20 meters long, weighs about 100 metric tons, these things, massive payload capacity, requires specialized, heavily modified submarine carriers for deployment. There's 2 of them in Russia's fleet, and they can each carry 6 of these things. So there's 12 of these unmanned underwater vehicles in play at the moment. Propulsion, miniaturized liquid metal nuclear reactor, so they can keep going for fucking ages on their own. Grants effectively unlimited operational range and extraordinary endurance. Then you've got the performance. It can go up to 100 knots, which is 185 kilometers an hour, and can go as far down as 1,000 meters below the sea. So you will not detect this thing on its way. Speed and depth render the UUV immune to interception by current Western anti-submarine warfare torpedoes. So there's nothing they can do. The guidance is autonomous AI combined with what they call GLONASS satellite connectivity, capable of navigating complex seabed topography without human intervention or active external control signals. And then the last bit is about the payload. So they could have up to 2 megaton thermonuclear warhead or conventional warheads on board, capable of obliterating entire coastal regions, naval bases, and carrier strike groups. So the unprecedented speed of the Poseidon is achieved through the fluid dynamics phenomenon known as supercavitation. By emitting a specialized gas bubble from its nose cone, the UUV completely envelops its hull in a continuous void, minimizing physical water contact and drastically reducing hydrodynamic drag. Because of its extreme depth, supercavitating speed, and the autonomous artificial intelligence guidance of Poseidon is effectively immune to interception by the current generation of NATO anti-submarine warfare networks. The Russian Navy is currently adapting a fleet of specialized submarines to serve as carrier platforms for these weapons. The Belgorod, a heavily modified Oscar II class submarine, was formally commissioned to carry the drone alongside the newly launched and purpose-built Khabarovsk. Russian defense industry sources indicate plans to deploy up to 32 of these drones across the Northern and Pacific fleets. This deployment strategy allows the carriers to launch the Poseidon from the heavily protected sanctuary of the Russian Arctic Bastion, allowing the autonomous drones to traverse the Atlantic Ocean completely undetected. Oh dear. And the mega tsunami threat versus scientific reality. The stated purpose of the Poseidon is actually to deliver a massive thermonuclear payload, but directly into coastal infrastructure of adversity. So the Russian state media and political rhetoric heavily promote the weapon as an apocalyptic doomsday device capable of generating a radioactive mega tsunami up to 500 meters high, designed to inundate and permanently irradiate the shorelines of the United States and the United Kingdom. However, Western intelligence assessments and oceanographic analysis offer a bit more of a grounded yet equally devastating perspective. So studies of underwater nuclear detonations, including data gathered during the Cold War, indicate that wave energy dissipates rapidly across shallow continental shelves. So consequently, a true ocean crossing mega tsunami is scientifically improbable. The wave dynamics simply can't sustain a 500-meter wall of water over vast distances. It's a bit ridiculous, says us. Despite this, a localised detonation off the coast of the UK would still cause catastrophic civilization-altering damage. The blast would generate a massive, highly radioactive storm surge capable of penetrating up to 5 kilometres inland. Such an event would instantly annihilate strategic military ports such as HMBC Clyde Faslane, the home of the UK's Vanguard class submarines and its continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, or decimate major economic hubs like London, Southampton or Liverpool. The true strategic value of the Poseidon does not rely on cartoonish tidal waves. It lies in its ability to completely bypass traditional ballistic missile defence systems by moving the nuclear threat from exo-atmosphere to the abyssal depths. Russia has invalidated billions of dollars invested in Western aerospace defence, forcing NATO into a frantic, highly expensive race to secure the seabed. So the US-UK response, Project Reef and Atlantic Bastion. So recognising this existential, uncontested vulnerability, the UK Ministry of Defence and the US Defence Innovation Unit launched an urgent joint initiative in late March 2026, the Robotic Exclusion and Engagement Framework, REEF, with rapid submission deadline of April the 3rd, 2026. The REEF programme is desperately seeking commercial and military-grade technologies capable of detecting, trafficking, classifying and physically defeating unmanned underwater vehicle threats. The solicitation explicitly acknowledges that current allied solutions are fragmented, expensive and limited in number. REEF demands the creation of a common operating picture that integrates fired, moored buoys, buried seabed sensor cables and or mobile autonomous platforms like USVs, UUVs utilising advanced sensor fusion and edge processing to distinguish genuine fast-moving threats from biological anomalies like whales and shit. Simultaneously, the UK announced the Atlantic Bastion programme as part of its Strategic Defence Review. Atlantic Bastion seeks to create a hybrid navy where crewed warships operate in seamless tandem with AI-driven autonomous vehicles to guard the undersea cables, counter the incursions of the Russian Northern Fleet. However, these initiatives are currently in their conceptual infancy. The technological gulf between the operational reality of the supercavitating Poseidon and the aspirational goals of Reef leaves the UK coastline profoundly exposed, relying entirely on the hope that mutually assured destruction holds firm. Active escalations in the North Sea Channel. So the theoretical threats of shadow fleets and UUVs are compounded by the physical daily reality of the Russian military operating with increasing audacity near the British shores. Sorry, just had to have a quick drink there. Bit of a dry mouth. Throughout late March and early April 2026, the presence of the Russian surface and submarine fleets in UK waters reached intensity levels reminiscent of the Cold War. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin by global deployments, was forced to activate a continuous layered deterrent posture. I won't bore you with that, but the transit of the Krasnodar was particularly indicative of high-stakes environment. Operating on the surface due to rough seas, the submarine was continuously shadowed by a Merlin Mark II helicopter operating from the RFA Tide Surge. The Merlin air crew utilised dipping sonars, sonar buoys and onboard processing systems to maintain a constant classification of the contact. The Royal Navy publicly noted that the air crews maintained a posture ready to instantly shift into full anti-submarine warfare mode, armed with Stingray lightweight torpedoes should the Russian vessel attempt to submerge and evade monitoring in the sensitive waters of the Dover Strait. These shadowing operations represent a daily grinding reality wherein the Royal Navy uses finite, highly expensive resources to monitor the adversary that operates with persistent impunity near the UK coastline. As Defence Secretary John Healey noted, these operations are designed to send a clear signal to Putin that the UK remains focused on European defence despite distractions in the Middle East. However, the sheer volume of Russian traffic threatens to overwhelm the available patrol architecture. The counter-indicative coalition, NATO's paradoxical reliance on Russia, so the UK's aggressive maritime interdiction posture, the urgent funding of air defence for Ukraine and the push for rearmament in the stark, often hypercritical contrast to the severe economic paralysis gripping the broader NATO alliance despite over 4 years of brutal warfare in Eastern Europe and endless diplomatic rhetoric regarding the European solidarity. Several key NATO and EU member states remain entirely reliant on the very Russian resources that they're ostensibly trying to sanction and isolate. So there's an illusion of economic decoupling. So data from the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air paints a damning picture of a fractured alliance. In early 2026, the European Union remained the fourth largest buyer of Russian fossil fuels globally, so the financial volume of this trade is staggering. In August 2025 alone, the EU spent 1.15 billion on Russian energy. So you've got these European importers of Russian fossil fuels, Hungary, Slovakia, France, Netherlands and Belgium. They all buy millions of pounds of euros worth of natural gas and crude oil and pipeline gas. So while the importation of pipeline gas to certain Western European regions has diminished, imports of Russian liquefied natural gas remain robust. In fact, LNG accounted for 55% of the revenues generated from the EU in early 2026. This dynamic creates a fundamentally counter-indicative strategic position. A military alliance cannot establish a credible unified deterrent posture when a significant bloc of its member states is actively funding an adversary's military-industrial complex to prevent their own domestic economic collapse. US President Donald Trump has aggressively weaponized this paradox, presenting NATO allies and threatening to withhold American military support by pointing out the strategic absurdity of Europe funding the war against themselves. The global resource laundering loophole. So the Western sanctions regimes are further undermined by a massive geopolitical laundering operation facilitated by India and China. While direct European imports of Russian crude have fallen heavily since the 2022 invasion, Russian overall fossil fuel export revenues saw a 7% month-on-month increase in early 2026. China continues to dominate direct purchase of Russian coal and crude oil. More alarmingly, India has positioned itself as the primary intermediary of Western consumption. India imports vast quantities of heavily discounted raw Russian crude, refines it in domestic facilities such as the Vadinar refinery, and subsequently sells the finished petroleum products back to European and Western markets at a premium. In early 2026, the US Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control even codified this loophole, issuing General License 133, which temporarily authorized the sale of Russian crude to India to prevent a catastrophic global supply shock, which would be caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran conflict. This convoluted supply chain highlights the inescapable reality of the global economy, that the global economy remains far too fragile to fully excommunicate Russian hydrocarbons. For NATO, this absolute reliance severely limits the severity of non-kinetic punishments available. Severing ties entirely would plunge European manufacturing into darkness, trigger catastrophic civilian inflation, and likely fracture the political cohesion of the EU. Consequently, the alliance is forced into a posture of appeasement, tolerating the Russian hybrid aggression, shadow fleet operations, and seabed espionage below the threshold of an Article 5 declaration out of sheer economic necessity. The veil of secrecy, public interest versus intelligence classification. Given the stark reality of undefended skies, nuclear super torpedoes, shadow fleets occupying sovereign waters, and a faltering NATO economic strategy, a vital question emerges. Why is the British public not acutely aware of how vulnerable they truly are? The answer lies in complex, historically entrenched, and often controversial philosophy governing the classification of military intelligence in the United Kingdom. So Britain possesses a deeply ingrained culture of state secrecy. For decades, the government refused to even officially acknowledge the existence of MI6 or the extent of its domestic surveillance apparatus. Today, the mechanisms of military secrecy are managed through the newly minted Military Intelligence Service, MIS. Announced in late 2025 as a core component of the Strategic Defence Review, the MIS consolidated previously fragmented and dispersed defence intelligence branches under the Cyber and Specialist Operations Command. This restructuring was designed to improve interoperability, institutional memory, and response times to hybrid threats. The justification for the blackout: deterrence and methodology. The primary operational justification for suppressing tactical intelligence regarding homeland vulnerability is the preservation of deterrences through ambiguity. So the intelligence community rigidly adheres to the policy of neither confirm nor deny. If the MOD were to publicly publish the exact operational readiness of the Type 45 destroyers, admit the precise gaps in mainland radar coverage, or confess that the Reef programme currently possesses no functional deployable countermeasure against the Poseidon, it would invite opportunistic, highly targeted aggression. By keeping the exact dimensions of the UK's defensive gap classified, military planners force Russian strategists to operate with a margin of doubt, complicating their risk calculus. Although it has just said all of that shit in the fucking article from stuff it found somewhere online. So there we are. Secondly, revealing intelligence regarding Russian incursions invariably exposes the sources and methods used to gather that data. So if the MOD were to publicly detail the exact movements of the Yantar and how it was tracked, it would simultaneously reveal the capabilities of the classified sound surveillance system, undersea listening for networks, or the specific algorithmic triggers used by Nordic Warden AI. Protecting the methodology of intelligence gathering is often deemed more critical than the intelligence itself. The democratic deficit. However, this systemic overclassification is increasingly clashing with the public interest. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy has repeatedly warned that a fundamental societal shift, noting that long-term security inevitably carries short-term, unpalatable financial costs. I think I missed a bit out there, didn't I? Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy has repeatedly warned that preparing for a worst-case scenario requires a fundamental societal shift, noting that long-term security inevitably carries short-term, unpalatable financial costs. It's pretty heavy-hitting stuff, isn't it, really? The government cannot justify slashing domestic social spending, raising taxes, or implementing the two-child benefit cap to fund a multi-billion-pound Iron Dome architecture or the Atlantic Bastion programme without explicitly explaining the existential threat to the electorate. The delayed defence investment plan, heavily criticised in Parliament in March 2026 for stalling crucial military procurement and leaving the nation vulnerable, suffers precisely because the absolute urgency of the threat remains locked inside classified briefing rooms. The public is being asked to bear the severe economic brunt of the national rearmament without being allowed to see the severity of the forces massing at the door. In conclusion, current operations and the stark picture of escalation. As of April 2026, the United Kingdom's military operations represent a frantic, highly professional effort to plug holes in a dam that's simultaneously cracking on multiple strategic fronts. The armed forces are heavily committed abroad, undertaking vital air defence roles in Ukraine through emergency £100 million funding packages, managing the geopolitical fallout of the Iranian conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, and attempting to initiate an AI-powered munitions clearing and drone countermeasures on the modern battlefield. Domestically, they're engaged in legally complex, high-risk maritime interdiction against an adversary's sprawling shadow fleet, while tracking advanced guided missiles, frigates and submarines through the narrow confines of the English Channel and the North Sea. Yet, despite the valour, operational integration and tactical proficiency of British personnel, the structural reality is undeniably grim. The UK military has been severely hollowed out following decades of post-Cold War divestment and peace dividend economics. Former top army commanders have publicly admitted that the gifting of heavy armour and artillery to allied nations has left the British military temporarily weaker and fundamentally unprepared for high-intensity peer conflict. The inability to defend the homeland from a ballistic or hypersonic barrage, combined with the catastrophic asymmetric threat of Poseidon UUV and the persistent mapping of critical seabed infrastructure, dictates that the UK cannot currently survive a sustained kinetic engagement with the Russian Federation without total reliance on United States intervention. This reliance is the ultimate fatal vulnerability, with political factions in Washington actively threatening to abandon European defence commitments, demanding that Europe reduce its reliance on the US, and pivoting American resources entirely to the Middle East or the Indo-Pacific. Europe faces a terrifying worst-case scenario. If immediate substantive peace talks and amicable diplomatic agreement regarding ongoing European conflicts are not achieved as soon as possible, the trajectory points towards the systemic rapid collapse of regional security. A failure of deterrences in 2026 will not resemble the slow, grinding land wars of the 20th century. It will be a rapid, tech-heavy conflagration designed to cripple the state before mobilisations can occur. It will begin in the abyssal depths, with deniable shadow fleet vessels and immune intelligence platforms severing the transatlantic fibre optic cables, instantly blinding global financial markets and communication grids. This will be followed by the rapid occupation of strategic Arctic choke points, such as the Norwegian Svalbard archipelago, by Russian naval infantry, presenting NATO a devastating fait accompli. Simultaneously, autonomous subsurface detonations utilising systems like Poseidon will render coastal infrastructure irradiated and useless, while hypersonic cluster munitions bypass non-existent air defences to paralyse command and control centre. The UK Ministry of Defence understands this stark picture intimately, operating tirelessly in the shadows to modernise and adapt through rapid innovation initiatives like the Atlantic Bastion and Project Reef. But autonomous technologies take years to produce, test and deploy, where geopolitics can fracture in seconds. Until the United Kingdom can field a comprehensive multi-domain defence shield capable of securing both its skies and its seabed, diplomacy remains the only viable mechanism standing between the fragile status quo and a catastrophic national failure. Thanks for that. Cheers. I'm going to have my lunch. Hopefully there won't be a war. Thanks.